She had been working for 14 hours straight when the old man in room 12 finally spoke his first words to her in 3 weeks. What he said would change everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be alive. Emily Carter had learned a long time ago not to check the clock during a night shift. Clocks were the enemy when you were tired. They moved too slowly when you needed them to fly, and they vanished entirely when a patient needed you most. She had been working the overnight shift at Meadowbrook Senior Living Center for nearly 4 years, and in that time, she had developed a very specific relationship with time, one built entirely on survival. It was a Tuesday in November when she arrived at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her shift was supposed to begin. She always came early, not because anyone asked her to, not because the administration rewarded punctuality. They didn't. She came early because she knew what it felt like for the residents when a familiar face at the door was replaced by a stranger, even for a moment. She had seen the fear in their eyes. She had heard the confusion in their voices. And she had promised herself, quietly, years ago, that she would never be the reason someone felt that fear. The halls of Meadowbrook smelled like antiseptic and something softer underneath. Lavender, she had always thought, though she could never quite identify the source. The overhead lights hummed a constant, low note that most people stopped hearing within their first week. Emily still heard it. She had never decided whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. She signed in, changed into her scrubs, and pulled her dark hair back into a ponytail. The evening nurse, Danielle, met her at the station with a clipboard and the kind of expression that said the day had been long. "Mrs. Calloway had another fall," Danielle said, clicking her pen. "She's okay, just shaken. Dr. Patel came by. And room 12. She paused. "Room 12 is the same." Emily nodded slowly. Room 12 was always the same. Room 12 was Arthur Hayes, but she had no idea yet just how wrong that assessment was about to become. Arthur Hayes had arrived at Meadowbrook 6 weeks earlier, delivered by a social worker named Priya, who had handed the staff a single manila folder and a small leather suitcase. The folder contained the usual documents: medical history, emergency contacts, insurance information. The suitcase contained 3 changes of clothes, a pair of worn reading glasses, and one photograph in a silver frame that Arthur placed face down on the nightstand the moment he was left alone. He was 87 years old. His emergency contact, a woman named Sarah Hayes Moretti, had a phone number with a Los Angeles area code and a note beside it that read, "Contact only in medical emergency. Does not visit." In 6 weeks, Emily had tried everything. She brought him books. He wouldn't look at them. She left music playing softly from the hallway. He asked her to turn it off. She tried conversation about the weather, about the food, about the faded watercolor paintings on the walls. Arthur would sometimes nod. Sometimes he would look at her with those gray eyes of his, deep set beneath heavy brows, and say nothing at all. The staff had a quiet consensus. Arthur Hayes had come to Meadowbrook to disappear. Emily didn't believe that. She couldn't explain why, but she didn't believe that. What she didn't know yet was that Arthur Hayes had a secret so enormous, so heartbreaking, that he had spent the last 40 years of his life trying to outrun it. It was on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into Emily's ongoing one-sided acquaintance with Arthur, that she noticed something she hadn't before. She had come to collect his dinner tray, which was, as usual, mostly untouched. She was reaching across the table when she accidentally knocked the remote control to the floor. As she bent to pick it up, she glanced beneath the nightstand. The photograph in the silver frame was no longer face down. It was leaning against the leg of the nightstand, tilted at an angle. Not quite upright, but no longer hidden. Emily didn't look directly at it. She straightened, gathered the tray, and moved toward the door. But in that half-second glance, she had seen enough. It was a photograph of a grand piano. Not of a person, not of a family. A piano. She carried the tray down the hall and stood at the nurse's station for a long moment, her mind working quietly. A photograph of a piano, placed face down on a nightstand for weeks. Then, for reasons unknown, shifted. Not displayed. Not put away. Just shifted. She went back to her rounds, but she thought about that photograph for the rest of the night. And when she finally found out why Arthur had that picture, nothing could have prepared her for the truth. But the most shocking thing wasn't what she found. It was what she did next. The Meadowbrook Library was a small room at the end of the East Wing, rarely used, stocked with donations of paperback novels, large print puzzles, and 3 outdated encyclopedias. Emily spent her lunch break there on Thursday, her phone in her hand, searching. Arthur Hayes. She typed the name, not expecting much. Then she added a second word, piano. The first result stopped her cold. Arthur R. Hayes. Concert pianist. Carnegie Hall debut, 1962. Winner of the International List competition, Brussels, 1964. Named by the New York Times as one of the most gifted pianists of his generation. She stared at the screen. Then she scrolled. There were reviews, photographs, a young man at a grand piano, his hands hovering over the keys with an expression of absolute concentration. And something else. Something that looked, even in a grainy black and white photograph from 60 years ago, like pure joy. And then the article stopped, abruptly. 1971. There was nothing after 1971. No concerts, no recordings, no interviews. Arthur Hayes, one of the most gifted pianists of his generation, had simply vanished from every public record at the age of 34. Emily set her phone down on the table. She sat very still. The question wasn't what had happened to Arthur Hayes. The question, the one that would haunt her for weeks to come, was why. That evening, she knocked on the door of room 12 before entering, the way she always did. Arthur was in his chair by the window, looking out at the parking lot. The lamp beside him cast a warm, narrow light across his profile. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," she said, setting his medication on the table. "The beef stew tonight is actually not bad. I tried some. That's a first." Silence. She wasn't surprised. She began straightening the blanket on his bed, moving quietly around the room. And then, as casually as she could manage, she said, "I heard something beautiful in the lobby today. Someone had classical music on. Liszt, I think. The Liebestraum." She didn't look at him. She kept smoothing the blanket. The silence that followed was different from the other silences. She felt it change, the way a room's temperature shifts before a storm. She finished with the blanket, gathered her things, and moved toward the door. Number 3. She turned around. Arthur Hayes was still looking at the window, but his jaw was set differently. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, had tightened almost imperceptibly around the worn fabric. "Excuse me?" Emily said softly. "Liebestraum number 3. His voice was rough from disuse, low and careful, like a man testing ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. "There are 3. You would know which one if you had heard it." Emily Carter stood very still in the doorway of room 12. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Arthur Hayes looked directly at her. And in that look, she saw something she had not expected to see. She saw grief so deep it had turned into stone. This was the moment everything changed. But even Emily didn't know how far the change would go. After that evening, things changed. Not dramatically. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no tearful confessions over a dinner tray. Arthur Hayes was not that kind of man. But the silence between them became a different kind of silence, one with doors in it. He began eating more. He let her open the curtains in the morning. Once, when she mentioned offhandedly that she had never understood classical music growing up, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No one does," he said, "until they do." She asked him about his past over the course of several evenings. He answered in fragments, a sentence here, a pause there, a memory offered, and then quickly taken back, like a man handing you something precious and then changing his mind. He had grown up in Ohio. His mother had been a piano teacher. He had practiced 6 hours a day from the age of 8. He had performed at Carnegie Hall at 25. He had been, in his own words, going somewhere. "What happened?" Emily asked one night, without planning to. The pause that followed was the longest he had ever given her. "I made a choice," he said finally. "The only choice I could make. And then I spent the rest of my life wondering if it was the right one." He didn't say anything more that night. But 2 days later, Emily found something in the file room that told her exactly what that choice had been. And it broke her heart. She hadn't been snooping. She had been pulling records for an insurance update when the manila folder for room 12 slipped from the shelf and scattered across the floor. As she gathered the pages, one caught her eye. It was a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Hayes withdraws from Brussels competition following family tragedy. Wife diagnosed, pianist abandons career." Emily sat down on the floor of the file room and read. In 1971, Arthur Hayes's wife, Caroline, had been diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition. She would require full-time care. The treatments were expensive. The concerts, the tours, the late nights, and the months abroad. None of it was compatible with what Caroline needed. And so Arthur Hayes, at the peak of his talent, at the precise moment when the world was beginning to truly see him, had walked away. He had never performed again. He had cared for Caroline for 22 years, until her death in 1993. Then he had raised their daughter, Sarah, alone. And at some point, Emily didn't know exactly when something had broken between them. The estrangement, the Los Angeles phone number. "Does not visit." Emily put the article back in the folder. She sat on the floor a few minutes longer. Then she stood up, washed her face in the staff bathroom, and went back to work. But she had already made a decision. One that the administration would not approve of. One that might cost her job. And she was absolutely certain it was the right thing to do. Wait, don't miss this detail. Because what Emily did next set off a chain of events that nobody in that building was ready for. Meadowbrook Senior Living Center had a common room on the ground floor with a piano in the corner. It was a small, upright, old, slightly out of tune. A volunteer came on the 3rd Sunday of every month to play hymns. Otherwise, it sat untouched. Emily went to Margaret's office on a Friday morning. "I'd like to bring one of our residents down to the common room to use the piano," she said. Margaret looked up with the expression she reserved for requests she had already decided to refuse. "Which resident?" "Arthur Hayes, room 12. Mr. Hayes has shown no interest in social activities. He hasn't attended a single group event." "He was a concert pianist," Emily said. Before he came here, he played Carnegie Hall. He gave it up to care for his wife. He's been here for 6 weeks, and no one has offered him the one thing that was ever truly his. The silence in the office was uncomfortable. The piano in the common room isn't in great condition, Margaret said at last. I know, Emily said. I'm asking anyway. Margaret gave her approval. But what happened next, what Emily could not have predicted, nearly destroyed everything she had worked for. She brought it up to Arthur on a Sunday afternoon, during a quiet stretch between lunch and dinner. She sat across from him and told him what she had read. She didn't apologize for finding it. She just told him, plainly and quietly, the way she had learned to tell difficult truths. Arthur listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was looking at the floor. I figured someone would eventually, he said. These things get found. I'm not here to pry, Emily said. I just want you to know that there's a piano downstairs. And if you ever wanted to... No. Okay. It's been 53 years, Emily. It was the first time he had used her name. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to perform. I'm just saying it's there. She left it at that. For 11 days, Arthur said nothing more about the piano. Emily didn't push. She had learned by now the geography of his silences. She knew which ones were closed doors and which ones were doors left just barely ajar. On the 12th day, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Arthur Hayes appeared at the nurse's station in his best sweater, a grey wool one she had never seen him wear before, and said, Is anyone using that room? Emily turned around, and for just a moment, she couldn't speak. And you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Because what came out of that common room on that afternoon, nobody planned it. Nobody expected it. And nobody would ever forget it. She walked with him down the hall. She didn't take his arm. He didn't want that. She matched his pace, slow and deliberate, and they made their way to the common room in a silence that was entirely different from all the ones that had come before. The room was empty. Afternoon light came through the western windows in long, flat angles. The piano sat in the corner like something waiting to be remembered. Arthur stopped about 6 feet away from it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. He looked at the keys for what felt like a very long time. His hands were in his lap. Emily could see them trembling slightly. She didn't know if it was age or nerves or something else entirely. Then he raised his hands and placed them on the keys. And he played. Not the list. Not Carnegie Hall. He played something slow and searching, something that sounded less like a performance and more like a question being asked of a very old friend. Notes that wandered, paused, found their footing, wandered again. The piano was out of tune. She had known it would be, but somehow that made it more beautiful, not less. Like a voice recovered after a long illness, rough around the edges, but unmistakably itself. Emily stood by the window and felt something move through her chest that she had no word for. Arthur played for 22 minutes. When he stopped, he sat with his hands in his lap again. He didn't turn around. It's out of tune, he said. Yes, Emily agreed. I could hear where I was wrong. You weren't wrong, she said. He turned then and looked at her over his shoulder. The afternoon light caught the side of his face. And Emily Carter, who had spent 4 years learning to hold herself together at work, who had held hands through final breaths and sat with families in the darkest rooms of the darkest days, felt tears on her face before she even realized she was crying. Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the piano. Same time Thursday, he said. And that was how it began. Over the next 3 weeks, Arthur Hayes came to the common room every Thursday and Sunday at 2:30. Emily arranged her schedule around it, quietly, without drawing attention, trading shifts with a colleague when she needed to. Other residents began to drift in, not because anyone announced it, just because music travels through walls. Mrs. Calloway, who had fallen twice and moved with a walker, started appearing in the doorway on Thursdays. A retired schoolteacher named Howard would sit in the back corner and close his eyes. A woman named Rosa, who spoke very little English and had seemed entirely unreachable, sat in the front row one Sunday and wept quietly and beautifully through the entire session. Arthur noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. His playing changed. It became less searching, more deliberate. He began playing songs people might recognize alongside the classical pieces. A standard here, a hymn there. Once, something Emily couldn't identify, something soft and private, played very quietly, that she somehow knew he had composed himself. But even as this small miracle unfolded on Thursday and Sunday afternoons, something else was developing beneath the surface. Something Emily hadn't anticipated. Something that would crack this entire story wide open. She found the voicemail by accident, and when she heard the name, everything she thought she understood about Arthur Hayes rearranged itself completely. She had been covering the front desk during a staffing crunch. Not her job, technically, but she had filled in before. The phone had rung and the message had recorded, and when she went to log it in the system, she heard the name. "This is a message for Meadowbrook Senior Living regarding a resident, Arthur Hayes. My name is Sarah Hayes Moretti. I'm his daughter. I'm calling because..." A pause, a long one. "I heard he's been playing piano again. I don't know how that's possible, but someone sent me a video. I need to know if it's true." Emily stared at the phone. Someone had filmed Arthur playing. Someone had shared it, and it had reached, across the continent, the one person in Arthur's life who was listed in his file under "Does Not Visit." She picked up the phone and called Sarah Hayes Moretti back. What Sarah told her during that 12-minute phone call would change the shape of this entire story, and Emily had no idea what she was about to walk into. Sarah answered on the second ring. She sounded younger than Emily had imagined, her voice tight and carefully controlled, the voice of someone who had learned not to let things show. They talked for 12 minutes. Emily listened more than she spoke. The estrangement between Arthur and Sarah was not cold. It was not indifference. It was the result of a single, devastating conversation that had taken place 6 years ago, when Arthur had told Sarah that she had wasted her life, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular blindness of a man who had watched his own talent disappear and could not bear to see his daughter shrink from hers. Sarah was a musician too, a cellist, trained, talented, who had chosen, for reasons of her own, to step back from performing after the birth of her children. The echo had been too perfect, too painful, and Arthur, who had sacrificed everything, had said the wrong words at the worst possible time. "He doesn't know," Sarah said. "He doesn't know that I stopped playing because I was scared, not because I didn't love it. He thinks I gave up." "Do you still play?" Emily asked. A long pause. "Sometimes, at home, when the kids are asleep." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Your father plays every Thursday and Sunday," she said carefully. "At 2:30. The next session is in 4 days." The line was silent for a very long time. "I live in Los Angeles," Sarah said finally. "I know," Emily said. The call ended. Emily set down the phone. She didn't know what Sarah would do, but she knew, with the particular certainty that comes from years of sitting with people in their most vulnerable moments, that she had just set something in motion that could not be taken back. Now, nothing you've seen so far could prepare you for what happened next. Because on that Thursday at 2:30, something walked through the door of the Meadowbrook common room that nobody in that building expected to see. The session began as usual. Arthur came at 2:30 in his grey sweater. Mrs. Calloway was already in the doorway. Howard was in the back corner. Rosa was in the front row. Emily stood by the window, the way she always did. Arthur sat at the piano. He adjusted his glasses. He placed his hands on the keys. He played the list. The real one, the Liebestraum No. 3, the one Emily had named in his room 6 weeks ago, not knowing what she was setting in motion. It filled the common room with something enormous and aching and completely alive. Emily watched the faces of the people in the room change as the music moved through them, and she thought, "This is the most important thing I have ever done in this job. Not the medications, not the paperwork, not the 14-hour shifts. This." She was still thinking it when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around. A woman was standing in the doorway of the common room. She was in her mid-50s, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, wearing a coat still buttoned from the journey. She was holding a cello case. She had come. Emily stepped back. She moved to the far edge of the room and became as invisible as she knew how to be. Arthur was still playing. He hadn't turned around. And then the list ended, and the room held its breath. And Sarah Hayes Moretti walked in. She walked slowly, the cello case against her side, and stopped about 10 feet from the piano. Arthur still had his back to her. He was looking at the keys, his hands resting in the aftermath of the music. "Dad," Sarah said. The word was very quiet. Arthur's hands went still. He turned around on the bench. For a moment, just a moment, neither of them moved. The light in the room was afternoon light, long and gold, and the out-of-tune piano stood between them like everything they had ever failed to say. Then Arthur Hayes, 87 years old, who had walked away from Carnegie Hall for love and lived with the silence ever since, looked at his daughter and said, "You came." "Someone told me you were playing again," Sarah said. Her voice was breaking apart at the edges. "I am," Arthur said simply. Sarah looked at the cello case in her hand. She looked back at her father. "I brought this," she said. "I don't know why. I haven't played in front of anyone in years." Arthur said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned back to the piano and placed his hands on the keys. "I know a piece," he said. "Something I wrote a long time ago. I wrote it for you, actually. You were about 3 years old. You used to fall asleep to it." Sarah made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "I don't know if I can," she said. "Neither do I," Arthur said. "That's not the point." And in the corner of the room, by the window, Emily Carter pressed her hand flat against her chest and tried very hard to hold herself together. Sarah opened the cello case. She tuned the strings with the muscle memory of decades. She pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat beside the piano. Arthur played the first 4 bars alone, something slow and tender and searching, a melody that sounded like an apology and an embrace at the same time. Then Sarah placed her bow to the strings. They played together. It was imperfect. They had never rehearsed this. Sarah missed an entry and then found it again. Arthur slowed to let her recover. They adjusted to each other the way 2 people adjust when they have lost the habit of being in the same room. Carefully, with occasional missteps, with a willingness to try again. Mrs. Calloway in the doorway pressed her hand over her mouth. Howard in the back corner kept his eyes closed and his chin lifted. Rosa sat absolutely still, her hands folded, her expression one of complete peace. They played for 16 minutes. When they stopped, the room was very quiet. Arthur turned to his daughter. His eyes were wet. "You always had a better ear than me," he said. "You always had better hands," Sarah said. The silence between them was different from any silence Emily had ever witnessed in this building. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of two people who had finally stopped talking around the thing that mattered and stood directly inside it instead. Emily slipped out of the room. She walked to the end of the corridor and leaned against the wall and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had taught herself to breathe in hard moments, and she let the tears come without fighting them. Because this was why. This was always why. In the weeks that followed, Meadowbrook changed, but so did something else. Something Emily had been trying not to think about. Something that lives at the end of every story told in a place like this. Sarah drove back from Los Angeles again the following month, and the month after that. She and Arthur began working on pieces together, proper pieces, chosen deliberately. She joined him on Sundays. The common room began to fill. Margaret, who had initially been skeptical, started stopping by herself and standing in the back, pretending she had administrative reasons to be there. Arthur's appetite improved. His color improved. He began asking for the curtains to be opened every morning. He started reading again, music history mostly, but also the occasional novel. He left the photograph of the piano on the nightstand, right side up now, and beside it he placed a new one. Himself and Sarah, taken by one of the other residents on a phone, slightly blurry, both of them laughing. Emily watched all of this happen the way she watched most good things at Meadowbrook, from a distance, quietly, trying not to put her fingerprints on it. But Arthur noticed. He always noticed. One Thursday morning, 2 months after Sarah's first visit, he caught Emily in the hallway just before his session was about to begin. "You called her," he said. It was not a question. Emily met his gaze. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he had of acknowledging things that mattered without making a performance of it. "Good," he said. And he walked to the common room, and Emily heard the first notes begin, and she stood in the hallway alone for a moment and pressed her palm flat against the cool wall and let the music travel through it into her hand. Arthur Hayes declined in early spring. Not suddenly, the way it rarely is. Gradually, the way a tide goes out. More sleep, less appetite, a cough that lingered, a confusion in the mornings that cleared by afternoon, and then, as March arrived, stopped clearing entirely. He had a Tuesday in March when he recognized Emily and asked what day it was, and she told him, and he nodded and said, "I've been thinking about the Schubert, the B-flat sonata. Do you know it?" She didn't, but she looked it up that night on her phone, lying in bed in her apartment, listening with headphones, trying to understand what he heard in it. He had a Thursday when he came to the common room and sat at the piano and couldn't remember the piece he had wanted to play. He sat for 3 minutes, his hands on the keys, searching. Then he played something simple, scales almost, up and down, like a man finding his way back to the beginning. Sarah came on a Friday in late March and did not leave. Emily worked double shifts that week because she wanted to be there, and because she could not explain that to anyone who would have understood it. She sat with Arthur in the evenings when the other staff were elsewhere. She talked to him about nothing important, about the weather, about the music, about a television show she'd been watching. She talked because his breathing was better with someone's voice in the room, and because she had learned, over 4 years, that the most important thing you can offer a person in those last days is the sound of someone who is not afraid. She was not afraid. She was sad, which was different. 3 words. And you need to hear exactly what they were. On a Sunday morning in April, with Sarah holding his right hand and Emily sitting quietly in the chair by the window, Arthur Hayes said the last thing he ever said. He said it very clearly into the still room. It was worth it. And then he closed his eyes. The common room piano at Meadowbrook Senior Living Center was tuned the following week. Sarah arranged it and paid for it herself. She left a card on top of the piano with a handwritten note that the staff found on a Monday morning. It said, "For anyone who needs it." Emily read the card, put it back in its place on top of the piano, and went to start her shift. She was early. She was always early. She had learned a long time ago not to check the clock, but this morning she checked it. 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before she needed to be there. She stood in the hallway outside the common room and listened. The building was quiet. The lights hummed their low, familiar note. Somewhere down the hall, someone was waking up and would need her soon. Emily Carter took a breath. She thought about Arthur Hayes and the photograph of a piano placed face down on a nightstand. She thought about a young man at Carnegie Hall with his hands above the keys and something on his face that looked like pure joy. She thought about a choice made in love, and 50 years of silence, and 22 minutes of music on an out-of-tune piano on a Thursday afternoon. She thought about a daughter with a cello case standing in the doorway of a common room. She thought about 2 people playing a piece that had been written for a 3-year-old falling asleep. And she thought, this is why I do this. Not the medications, not the paperwork, not the 14-hour shifts in the humming light, not the pay that was never enough, or the recognition that almost never came. This. She pushed open the door to the common room and looked at the piano. Then she went to start her shift, because there were other rooms, other closed curtains, other silences that might have doors in them. And Emily Carter was not the kind of person who walked past a closed door without wondering what was on the other side. If this story moved you, if you've ever known someone like Arthur or someone like Emily, leave a comment below. Tell us about them. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, send it to them, because some stories aren't meant to be kept.